Well, good evening, everyone. Let's open our Bibles at the book of Ecclesiastes. The book of Ecclesiastes. Thank you to the praise group, praise team. Not sure what your official title is, but I've really enjoyed your playing and your singing today. Thank you so much. It's been lovely. And thank you to my hosts for your great hospitality this afternoon. And yes, I did have a nap, so there you go. All wise people do. All right, let's come to God's word. Let's read Ecclesiastes chapter 1, beginning at verse 12. I, the teacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. I devoted myself to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under heaven. What a heavy burden God has laid on men. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. What is twisted cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. I thought to myself, look, I have grown and increased in wisdom more than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. I have experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. Then I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom and also of madness and folly. But I learned that this, too, is a chasing after the wind. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. We'll end our reading there at verse 18. I wonder, when was the last time that someone gave you the wrong directions? At the time you received them, you thought, this is great. I know where I'm going. I'm on the right track. And so you set off on your journey full of hope, your boarding passes at the ready. But then gradually, as the hours pass by, you begin to realize that you're not seeing the signs that you were hoping for. And by the time you reach Enniskillen, you resign yourself to the fact that the only thing you're going to be boarding is a boat. And that's a great picture of false teaching, isn't it? Because that's what false teaching does. It sends you in the wrong direction. You think you're going in the right direction. The person you listened to sounded like they knew what they were talking about. But when you did what they said, the results were nothing like what you expected. Like getting the wrong directions to the airport. False teaching takes you away from where you should be. And instead it takes you to a place where you are left with nothing but frustration and disappointment. And so false teaching is a real problem. And that is especially the case when it comes to the Bible and the gospel. Because if there is one place that you do not want to be taken away from, it is heaven. And therefore it should come as no surprise to us that the Bible is full of warnings about false teachers. Jeremiah 14 Then the Lord said to me, the prophets are prophesying lies in my name. I have not sent them or anointed them. Lamentations 2. The visions of your prophets were false and worthless. Matthew 7. Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. And 2 Peter, but there were also false prophets among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you. And I don't need to rehearse a long list of false teachings for you that exist in our world today. You can name them yourself. All the false religions, all the cults and ideologies and everything else that you find on the internet. There is a constant supply of teaching that will take you away from the Lord. And we are all well aware of it. But even if we are, there are still those false teachings that catch us all out now and again, even our leaders. And so what I want to do over the few evenings that I am with you is have a closer look at a few false teachings that we are all susceptible to. And with the help of a certain wise king of Israel, prevent ourselves from going too far down the wrong road. And so what is this first false teaching that Solomon warns us of? Well, in the greatest of ironies, the first false teaching that Solomon teaches us about is the false teaching of wisdom. Now, how can that be, you might ask? Didn't the Lord commend Solomon for choosing wisdom? Isn't wisdom something that the Bible praises and celebrates? Well, that is, of course, true. But this is where the context of Ecclesiastes comes into play, because the whole of Ecclesiastes is essentially one long investigation. It is an investigation by Solomon to find out what is good and what is worthwhile in life. In other words, he wants to know what life is all about. What is the real purpose? What is the real meaning? And the final thing we need to know about this investigation is that it is conducted under heaven and under the sun. And if you read through the whole book of Ecclesiastes, then you will find these phrases, under heaven and under the sun, repeated again and again. And the reason for that is because Solomon wants to exclude God, who is above the heavens and above the sun. He wants to exclude him from the equation. And therefore, if we leave the spiritual part out of our thinking, if we take the world as we see it, if we take the world as we experience it, as many people do nowadays, what is good and what is worthwhile? And as you might imagine, being the wisest man who ever lived, Solomon thought that surely something as noble as wisdom would certainly prove to be good and worthwhile and provide mankind with plenty of purpose and meaning. And so he began his investigation. And as we read in verse 13, Solomon used his great gift to study and explore all that is done, to find out which things are worth doing, to find out which activities are most satisfying, to find out the activities that are the most important, the most beneficial, the activities that are the best things to do. In other words, Solomon just didn't want to waste any of his time. He wanted to be doing the things that really mattered, doing the things that produced results and progress. But in order to find these important activities, he was going to have to go through all of them. And as you might imagine, if you make a list of all the things that are done under the sun, then that is going to be one very long list, isn't it? But Solomon was not going to be put off by the enormity of this challenge. And if you look at the list of things he studied in chapter 2, then you can see that he gave it a pretty good go. There was all kinds of learning and science, and all kinds of pleasure that you could possibly imagine. And then he did building, and agriculture, and animals, and gardens, and wealth, and music. Everything you can think of, Solomon used his wisdom to study and explore it. But what does that really mean? Using his wisdom in this way. Well, if you look up the dictionary, then wisdom can be summed up as a combination of knowledge and experience and understanding in order to make the right decisions. And therefore, whenever Solomon talks about exploring every activity, what he really means is that he intends to drill down into each and every activity and gain as much knowledge and experience and understanding about that activity as he possibly can. And if you want to understand what that looks like, then we can take the most basic activity of eating as an example. And when you are exploring the activity of eating, what you are really talking about is food. And what a great thing to explore. Can you imagine it? Spending weeks of your life just looking for the best food. The food with the best taste. The food with the best texture. The food with the best color. And the best way to cook it. And the best things to eat with it. And the best condiments, the best presentation, the best plates, the best drink to go with it, the best cutlery, the best napkins, the best table setting, the best time of day, the best size of serving, and that's all before you get to dessert. It is amazing the depth to which you can study any activity under the sun. Whatever it happens to be. There are almost endless amounts of knowledge and understanding and expertise to be gained about any activity you can think of. Whether it is eating or drinking or agriculture or sport. And yet this was the challenge that Solomon took on. Is it any wonder he described it as a heavy burden? It's like going to university, but instead of just doing one degree, you decide to do every single degree in the prospectus. Whew, imagine the tuition fees. But that's what Solomon did. And in all of that study and exploration, you would think that he would definitely have found something worthwhile, something good, something meaningful. But the result was the complete opposite. In fact, the result was a complete tragedy. Because the conclusion that Solomon came to was that every single activity was completely and utterly worthless. It was meaningless. There was absolutely no point in any of it. And I want you to take a second and put yourself in Solomon's shoes for a moment. And just think about how this man must have felt after all that effort, all that study, all that work and exploration, and he found nothing. Not a little bit, not a decent amount, nothing. He might as well have been running around a field chasing a kite. Absolutely devastating. And the reason for this crushing realization is because of the simple fact that knowing more about something does not give it meaning. And you can keep on learning about that one thing all your life, but all that knowledge will not add a single ounce of purpose. And yet, despite this fact, this is the same mistake that humans continue to make. This is the conceit of academia. The striving for more and more knowledge and more understanding in the vain hope that in all their learning they will somehow find meaning and purpose, either in their subject or in their own expertise. But that is just not reality. And nor has it ever been so. And eating and food is a great example of that. For all the studies into food over the centuries, over the millennia, the skills and the techniques, the premier schools of high cuisine and the restaurants with all their Michelin stars, the most expensive meals that cost thousands of pounds, and yet it is still just food. And it is chewed and it is swallowed just the same as a Big Mac. Except a Big Mac might fill you up more. And you can apply the same reduction to any activity that you can think of. Travel, or music, science, or art. Because at the end of the day, this is not where meaning and purpose are found. No matter how much people want to believe it is. But if that is not the case, then what else can Solomon do with his wisdom? Well, having discovered that all his learning still left him far short of finding all the answers, which is the basic meaning of verse 15. Solomon now decided to turn his attention away from the physical world and instead look inwards. And what I mean by looking inwards is that Solomon would now look for what is good and worthwhile in his own mind. He would search his own thoughts for meaning and purpose. And that is what we see in verses 16 and 17. He recognizes that his own wisdom and knowledge have become so great that surely, with all this great intellect, he must be able to find the answers. And so he sets to work on this great project, gathering all the information that he can, observing, recording, pondering, evaluating the data. And then when the information is in, he reasons, he questions, he theorizes, and then he answers, and he writes, and he compiles, and he teaches. And all of this wasn't just for a season. No, it was for years and years, even decades of philosophy, working out life, what was good and worthwhile and meaningful. And you can just imagine all the scrolls piling up in the libraries. And this is something that Solomon even alludes to himself in the last chapter and verse 12, where he proclaims, of making many books there is no end. It's an endless task. But even after all this thinking and reasoning, what happens? Poor old Solomon comes to exactly the same conclusion as he came to before. All the wisdom, all the philosophy, all the understanding, it was all worthless and meaningless. And again, you can see how devastating this was for Solomon. In verse 18, instead of enlightenment and joy, there is only sorrow and grief. In fact, it's even worse than that, because the more wisdom and the more knowledge he accumulates, the worse the sorrow and grief seem to become. Poor Solomon. He had all the wisdom in the world and all the knowledge that could be gathered, but it still led him to a dead end. And yet, just as with the previous investigations, people today are still making the same mistakes and have been for thousands of years. Think about all the great philosophers: Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and more recent ones like Voltaire and Nietzsche and Marx, all praised and celebrated for their high thinking, but they all failed. They proclaimed that God is dead. They proclaimed that man could create or recreate a new civilization and a new society. They even tried to change the number of days in the week. But what happened? It was a massive failure. And it is still failing today. We have ideologies taking hold that are so bizarre that we can only conclude that this is the madness and folly that Solomon refers to in verse 17, thinking that is so high-minded that it falls over the other side. And yet, isn't that exactly what the Lord predicts in Romans 1? For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. But their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools. And so, if the application of wisdom is futile, and the study of wisdom itself is meaningless, then what is our conclusion? Well, our conclusion has to be that those who tell us that knowledge and understanding and philosophy are going to solve all the problems and give us all the answers, well, they are simply telling lies. They are false teachers. And we need to be on our guard against this false teaching of wisdom and knowledge. Because like most false teachings, it will simply come round again and again in different forms. And the most recent example of this was a group from about 20 or 30 years ago called the New Atheists. I don't know if you've heard of them before, but they were fairly well known. And Professor Richard Dawkins was the best known amongst them. And their message was basically that the world would be far better off. It would be liberated if we could get rid of these religious fairy tales. We have science. We have reason. We have rationalization. We can build a better world. And they pushed that message for years and years. And all their fellow academics loved it, and they were on TV and the radio all the time. But there was just one problem. And that was that while they were pushing this message, the society around them went absolutely insane. After rejecting religion, people chose something far worse. And it got so bad that many of these new atheists started calling themselves cultural Christians. That's right, they called themselves Christians because they could see that they had got it completely wrong. And why did they call themselves cultural Christians? Well, for the simple reason that when it comes to life and meaning and what is good and worthwhile, there is only one answer. And that answer is Jesus Christ. As we were thinking about this morning, He is the amazing one. He is the wonderful and the good. He is the one who makes everything better. And you can feel that in your Christian life. When you give thanks to the Lord every time you eat, you can enjoy your food more. And when you ask the Spirit of the Lord to guide your thinking, you find yourself having better thoughts. And you can take joy in your activities and your work, and you can have peace of mind when you sit down to rest. And you can do all of that because you have rejected the false teaching. And you have given your life to the wisdom of God, Jesus Himself, the one who gives you life and gives you life to the full. And may that be our experience tonight and forever. Amen.